So today, I think the last class we just discussed chapter 1 from Guy Cook, and I think there itself I told you that we'll be discussing about grammar, what are the types of grammars, and why do we need grammar for that matter, is there any need for grammar, so and the history of, let's say, the grammar, so to say, let's say what kind of grammar we need, whether it's a prescriptive grammar, descriptive grammar, or universal grammar for that matter, teaching grammar when you're talking about second language teaching, so there also we need grammar, so all these things, I know, all those things. You must have done all these details, minute details, about in your course, Introduction to Linguistics, or not only Introduction to Linguistics. You may have your basic understanding, from those school days. If you remember, you must. I don't know whether you remember or not. But because of some kind of mistakes you make, your teachers will scold you, will give you either bad mark, bad comments or whatever, and also you may get not A plus, or let's say a good mark, but some poor mark, in the examination, and especially way back, before somewhere in the 80s and 90s, we had seen that how this, so to say, the traditional teaching grammar, school grammar, and the way especially teachers used to beat students, nowadays that beating part is not there that much, but even in villages, teachers that do beat, students, in metropolitan cities it has reduced. So what I'm saying is that because of that kind of mistakes committed by you when you were a student, so either you are getting good scolding from your teachers, and not only from your teachers, maybe from your parents or also guardians, because whether it's a, an, or the, and all other stuff you see. So yeah, so briefly, that's what I'll be trying to talk about those things today in the class. And since it's a course, applied linguistics course, and mainly involved in teaching grammar, and teaching grammar, the traditional school grammar, what we are talking about, so those things, those details. So before I go, and discuss further, I know all those things, what is grammar, but briefly, I'll ask you some of these questions, basic questions, and then let's say we'll start our discussion. Okay. So the first question, let's say, the first question is, I know you know the answer of this question. What is grammar? So anyone just unmute yourself and just say, what is grammar?
It is probably the set of rules that we're supposed to follow while using the language.
Okay, so Diksha is saying that set of rules we are supposed to follow while using the language. Okay,
Uh,
okay, set
the
of
structure.
rules. Yes, Adya.
So the structure on which any language is based on.
Uh, Adya is saying the structure language is based on. Okay, structure language is based on. Okay, anything else? Any other input? There are many participants. I can see.
Sir, I think that grammar is a set of rules that describes the way a language works, but at times also prescribes a standard way of how a language should work. So it's like grammarians also at times like they take away from how the language has been functioning up until now, but they have a sense of it being a straight road and like it having a standard form or it having a concrete form. So like yeah, I think that they are more about describing the rules on which the language works on.
Okay, so Smriti has also made the point, set of rules, describe and explain things, and also prescribe when you talk about the standard things, and also she talked about the kind of historical, the function of the functional perspective as well. Okay, so anyone else would like to add something else, because we can talk about grammars, I can at least talk about grammars, more than at least 2 hours, or not only 2 hours. If you tell me to speak for grammar at least 5 to 6 hours, I can speak about grammars continuously, so it's only 2 or 3 lines about grammars, or you want to give a different kind of perspective, whatever it
So,
means.
grammar can be a way to standardize language, in the sense that to bring a sense of uh, formalness in language, so that it
Okay.
becomes standardized.
Okay, so Smriti, one is Smriti and another is Smriti. Okay, so only this Ra, Smriti. Okay, so Smriti is saying the standardized and formalness. Okay, so more or less that point is already discussed, Smriti. Yes, that's true. We need grammar also to standardize things, standardize the language.
So then,
Adya,
because grammar, we are able to understand the language. Like if a person doesn't formulate the language well, we won't be able to understand it.
so that's true. That's true also.
Sir,
Anyone else? Yeah, this is
sir,
Pratiti. Pratiti,
yes,
please
sir.
go ahead.
Sir, grammar is a structure or foundation that helps us to express ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Sir, a basic structure or a basic foundation that helps us to express ourselves.
Okay, so basic foundations that help us to express ourselves. So, taking kind of general kind of perspective, language, so like language equivalent to grammar, So, okay, Pratiti. Anyone else?
Sir, grammar
Yes, sir.
defines the way lexicon should behave.
Defines the way, Parul. What you said? The defines the way.
Lexicon or words should behave in a language. Like what are the roles they play and where do they come? How do they come and all of that.
Lexicon of, okay, so you are mainly talking about word formation things, how the words are formed. There has to be kind of constraints.
Also,
Are you
the
saying?
yes, the way words are formed and the way they are used in a sentence, their placing and where they are used, all of that.
Okay, so word formation perspective, Parul has added. Siddharth, please go ahead, Siddharth. You are there.
So, according to me, a grammar is a finite set of lexicon and a finite set of rules that we use in a language to produce infinite numbers of utterances and noble utterances.
Okay, so Siddharth, good. So we are now going into kind of theoretical things. Yes, good. That's what the finite set of rules by which we can make infinite set of utterances. So okay, Siddharth, good point. That's what the whole generative understanding. So finiteness from
As,
finiteness to non-finiteness, infiniteness. Sarah, you want to add something?
yes, grammar, I think, is also a study of the classes of words and their inflections and their functions and relations in the sentence.
Okay, so derivations, inflections. So mainly, Sarah wanted to add inflection derivations, and that is exactly true. If you look at the languages, mostly many classical languages, and not only classical languages, during this whole comparative method or historical reconstructions people who are doing all that kind of nominal declensions and verbal conjugations and all, so people did study, study languages by studying derivations and inflections. Yes, Sarah, yeah, to some extent you are right, Sarah, when you look at the historical construction thing.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you, sir.
So grammar also helps us to define that how lexicons will combine in a meaningful manner.
Okay, lexicon will combine in a meaningful manner. Okay, so I want something else, something new, something new, like maybe different perspective, maybe out of the box perspective. You are young people, and you should be full of new ideas, innovative ideas or something, Siddharth, you want to add something? Go ahead, Siddharth.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I think that grammar is inbuilt in our language, is inbuilt in our mind. When we speak language, we use that mind, which is known as competence, to to utter a sentence, and that is performance.
Okay, so yeah, it's another perspective. Grammar is somewhere in our mind or in our brain. The whole concept of UG, universal grammar, it's a human language faculty, So yes, something, something different, not the kind of. There is a person, Irfan Ali. Irfan Ali, is it the first time you're joining? I don't know. Irfan?
Yes, sir.
First time you're joining, Irfan?
Actually, it's my second class, sir.
Second class, okay. So Irfan, just could you introduce yourself, because since I know all of you, like those who are doing this course, applied linguistics. So where are you joining from, Irfan?
Sir, I'm from Ghaziabad, and I did my graduation from JNU itself in Arabic language.
Oh, Arabic language. Okay, so you must have done some optional course from our center. Have you done any optional course? No.
No, sir, no.
Okay. Mostly the people who like do their all those foreign languages, they come to our center and do all those optional courses offered by our center. Okay.
I wanted to, sir, but I couldn't, so that's why I joined the Masters in Linguistics.
Yeah, because of the intake capacity, only 35 intake capacity, and most of the students, they want to do optional course from our center. That's also one of the problems, the seat intake capacity. Okay, Irfan, so you're aware of JNU systems and all other stuff, since you are like internal to JNU internal system, Okay, Irfan, good to know. Anyone else joining for the first time or second time? We have not have not any introduction so far. Please unmute yourself and you can introduce yourself, so at least I can have a brief. Anyone for the first time or second time? Okay, no. So to say, now what we are talking about, grammar, and what is grammar, so, and you have different kind of perspectives, so to say, and so let's say, if I say grammar is a technical description of a language, you will say yes, grammar is a technical description of language. And let's say, and especially for linguists, whoever, so to a linguist, grammar is a set of elements and rules that make up of a language. So it's a set of rules or set of elements. That's what we already talked about. I think Diksha already pointed out, Smithy also pointed out, and all of you mostly pointed out that yes, it's a set of rules that make up a language. And I think Siddharth Saket talked about speakers' linguistic competence, so to say. So the grammar somewhere it's in our mind. So the whole understanding, the generative understanding about competence and performance. So language uses. So grammar somewhere it's in the speaker's mind, and so and some people, they say that grammar is something like unconscious rules that people follow when they speak or write. I think someone already made this point. It's unconscious rules. It's not conscious. It's rather unconscious rules that people follow when they speak or write. It's both, not only about speaking but also at the time of writing. And the whole understanding, if you are aware of Chomsky and the generative tradition, and Chomsky in SPE, I do not know whether we know the full form of SPE. SPE, we call it the sound pattern of English, SPE, sound pattern of English, Chomsky and Halley. That's the book, 1968, Chomsky and SPE, the sound pattern of English. So Chomsky and Halley categorically, they use the term, they say that we use the term grammar with a systematic ambiguity. On the one hand, the term refers to the explicit theory constructed by the linguist and proposed as a description of the speaker's competence. On the other, it refers to the competence itself. Try to understand, that's what Chomsky and Halley is saying, that we use the term with kind of a systematic ambiguity. So on the one hand, it refers to the explicit theory constructed by the linguist or proposed as a description of the speaker's competence. And on the other hand, it refers to this competence itself. So all those set of rules, and on the other hand, it refers to the competence itself. Okay. So Chomsky again in standard theory and standard extended theory says that any interesting grammar will be dealing with the mental processes that are far beyond the level of actual or even potential consciousness. Thus, grammar attempts to specify what the speaker actually knows, mainly again referring to the competence itself. So dealing with mental processes that are far beyond the level of actual or even potential consciousness. That's what we talked about, unconscious rules, And so try to understand that whoever, whether you are illiterate or literate, whether you know how to read or write, doesn't matter. All of us know the grammar of whatever the language we speak, So we all know the grammar. So the kind of technical description of those languages, that's a different thing. But by virtue of knowing a particular language, and we know the grammar of that particular language, So whichever the language, let's say a person from a rural place doesn't know how to read and write, but can speak, in our understanding, the person knows that particular language's grammar because he or she has the intuition. And even if somebody, an educated speaker for that matter, speaks an ungrammatical sentence, the person knows that it's an ungrammatical sentence because that intuition is making the judgment, grammatically, whether it's the sentence is grammatically formed or grammatically ill-formed. Okay, so well-formed or ill-formed. Okay, so something like an other understanding of grammar, mainly this is the linguistic understanding. I think in your introduction to linguistics class, I do not know whether you are aware, I think you must have done it, and maybe your teacher, whoever taught you introduction to linguistics, they must have told you that when you talk about grammar, our conception of grammar, there are different branches or modules are there. So one of the things when you talk about grammar, phonetics and phonology, morphology, syntax and semantics. These are the modules, let's say, which are the core modules, let's say. So, and any grammar book, descriptive grammar, prescriptive grammar for that matter, if you look at any grammar book, or let's say if you're writing a grammar of a particular language, whichever the language you speak, whether it's Bhojpuri, Maithili, Khota, whichever the language, Awadhi, Angika, let's say, if you're writing a grammar of a descriptive grammar of a particular language, in that case, you have to have a chapter on phonetics. Chapter on phonetics and phonology. Some people, they divide even these two, phonetics and phonology. You have to have a chapter on morphology, syntax, even semantics, and at times the sociolinguistics aspects as well. So I teach a course in JNU, writing grammar after this field method course. Field methods, so you go for data collection, and you need to write a dissertation in that course. And after that, I offer a course the name of the course, title of the course is Writing Grammar. So we discuss all those things, what are the things to be there, how to write a grammar, so writing grammar course is also taught, in JNU. Anyway, so what I'm saying is that linguistic understanding, the technical thing if we're talking about, so we have to have, these are the major branches, let's say core branches of linguistics or language for that matter. Phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, and semantics should be there, okay? So, and everyone who speaks a particular language knows the grammar of that language, everyone for that matter, let's say. As I told you, whether it's a literate person or illiterate person, okay? So, so now the types of grammar in our understanding, since you already know, I think at least 2 or 3 types. So prescriptive grammar and let's say descriptive grammar. So prescriptive grammars, what is prescriptive grammar? Prescriptive grammar, as you know, I think it's also pointed out by Smithy that prescriptive grammars is like to prescribe things, and the way, let's say, doctors also prescribe, the medicine, let's say, for a particular disease, what to have, and let's say particular medicine, when to have, whether it's before lunch or after meal or before meal, whatever, all that kind of do's and don'ts, what to do, what not to do, So prescriptive grammars, basically a list of do's and don'ts, and so prescriptive rules tell you how to speak or write, and so they prescribe how to speak or how to write, and this how to speak or how to write according to someone's idea of what is good and what is bad. So someone has that kind of notion that this is good and this is bad, and on the basis of that particular mindset or perception, they're going to prescribe that this is good and this is bad, and you should speak this way, you should not speak that way. So I'll try to talk about that with different rules, like there are certain rules. Actually, those rules which are there in Latin, and all those following prescriptive traditions, and they're still using Latin rules in English and telling that way, these are the things you need to do. So there are many. So I'll give you some examples. And so prescriptive rules make a kind of a value judgment about the correctness of an utterance and try to enforce uses that conforms with one formal form, one formal norm for that matter, you see. So prescriptive rules are mainly a catalog of do's and don'ts. So it's basically linguistic etiquette, the study of elegant or proper language use. So that kind of mindset, elegant or proper language use. So this prescriptive grammar, we also call it normative grammar or school grammar for that matter, as I told you, traditional school grammar. And so briefly, I'll just give you 2 or 3 examples of prescriptive rules. So 2 or 3 examples of prescriptive rules. Let's say one of the rules, prescriptive rules, and you'll find in any book, they say that do not use double negatives, because double negatives make it positive. So if anyone saying that I do not have nothing, that means don't and nothing, it makes it positive. That I don't have nothing means the sentence. So the kind of rules of logic they are bringing here in language, and they're saying that so you need to say, instead of I don't have nothing, you need to say I don't have anything. So but this is not exactly true. There are many languages. You will see that there are many languages, even many European languages, or Romance languages for that matter. They use Romance or Germanic languages for that matter. They use double negatives. Hindi for that matter, you will find lots of double negatives are used in a sentence. And that double negative, even if you're using double negatives, it doesn't mean that the sentence is a positive sentence. It's not necessarily. So I don't have nothing in other way. If you look at I don't have nothing, especially in Afro-American variety, many people they say I don't have nothing, mainly is emphasizing that yeah, I don't have nothing means nothing. You know, it's not positive. It's rather giving kind of emphasis, you know, and you'll find that kind of uses, you know, I don't have nothing in African American variety, you know, especially. So, and that's what emergence of a new variety also comes into picture, you know. So that's a different case. So, and another rule, prescriptive rules in English, they say that don't end a sentence with a preposition. Don't end a sentence with a preposition. So, where do you come from? So, let's say I was asking Irfan Ali, where are you from? Or where do you come from? So, mainly the people following the test in prescriptive tradition, they will say that, yeah, this sentence is wrong, you know, grammatically wrong. You need, so never end a sentence with a preposition, because from is a preposition here. So, but we have seen that in actual language use, what is happening is that in actual language use, there are many people, whether literate, illiterate, they do use this preposition at the end of a sentence, you know. And where do you come from? Many people, let's say, whether whichever the variety of English you speak, many people they okay. And another use nominative case after the verb be. So let's say someone says that, and you will find this example, it is me, it is me. Let's say if somebody is making noise, or let's say in this online lecture, somebody wants to ask some questions or something, you know, so I have to say, who is this? Or who is raising hand? So if you say it is me or something, you know, it's me we use. So prescriptive rules, they will say that no, it is not correct. You need to say it is I. So use nominative case after the verb be. It is. Is a be verb, you know, as you understand, and it should not be me, because me is accusative. So it is I. I should be nominative, you know. So they say use nominative case after the verb be. And another fuzzy rules, prescriptive fuzzy rules, why I'm saying fuzzy is that they say that never split an infinitive. So infinitive is another verb, and especially in English, the infinitive is used basically, let's say, to after to the verb which is used. Let's say to hide, to go, to know, whatever, you know, after. So they say that never split an infinitive. So in between the split infinitive, you should not add anything. So so if I say that to quickly hide, because the quickly, the word quickly, which is the adverb coming in between the verb and the to here. So they say, yeah, never split an infinitive. So if somebody is writing to quickly hide, people will say that this is ungrammatical, you know. So all these rules, whatever the rules I'm talking about, to some extent, it's the kind of perception people they do have because of English following the kind of, you know, perspective or the rules of Latin grammar. That's what I told you, that and those kind of Latin rules they are still using in English, you know, and as a result making that kind of perception that yeah, this is good, this is bad, this is ungrammatical, you know. But so now if you look at this to quickly hide, to hide, especially in Latin and French, the word is basically describere. It is one word, you know, the infinitive. It's a one word. But English, the formation of infinitive is different. And also the kind of double negatives, even if you look at English for that matter, in Old English, double negatives were used. And there are many languages. I'm talking about English, within English. In Old English, if you're talking about, double negatives were permitted. So another, let's say, French French. I do not know whether anyone of you know French or not. Anyone here present knows French?
Yes, sir, I do.
Who is this person?
Diksha.
Diksha. Diksha, how do you say I do not want to speak with anyone?
Je ne veux pas parler avec quelqu'un.
Je ne veux pas parler avec personne.
Avec personne, oui.
Person.
Yeah. Person means nobody.
Person is nobody, and also ne means also not.
Yes.
Okay. So see, so is even in this sentence, I don't want to speak with anyone. Even in French, double negatives are used. That's what I was saying. You know. So the kind of rules of logic cannot be applied in language. You know. So that's minus plus. You know. Or the mathematics, rules of mathematics are not exactly the same, you know. So there are many languages in the world. We do have this kind of double negatives are permitted, and as I also told you that using double negatives you can make the sentence more assertive, you know. So if somebody is saying that I don't have nothing means I don't have nothing, you know, and nothing, there is emphasis in nothing, you know, and regarding this, so prescriptive rules, so what we understand so far, the prescriptive rules are not based on actual uses. So how these prescriptive rules arise, if you look at, there is a whole history, you know, there is a tradition of these prescriptive rules, especially in Europe, in America. And so what do we understand so far? That in that 17th and 18th century, and mainly I'm talking about 17th and 18th century here, and the scholars were preoccupied with art and ideas and the language of ancient Greece and Rome, you know. And in that time, if you talk about the late 17th century and early 18th century, and this was the time somewhere, the Greece and Rome, this is the time, and Latin occupied a center stage and regarded as the perfect language. Still, Latin is regarded as one of the perfect language, because even the religious tradition is also there. The same way you can compare Latin with Sanskrit, you know. And so Latin occupied a center stage and regarded as the perfect language, you know, perfect language. Try to understand this. And other languages, let's say, the vernacular languages, you know, and the whole concept of perfection, imperfection, it's already there. So there are many people, and I think you know some of these people. I don't know whether you have heard about John Dryden, Daniel Defoe, Bishop Robert Luth, and Samuel Johnson, and there are many. So all these people, so they wanted to standardize English. Standardized or refined or polished English, and they wanted to fix it. That you see somehow English, depending on the variety or the vernaculars, so many people are using these and that, you know. So we need to fix English. So how to fix English? So and you have to have a model, and which is the model? And in this case, the model was basically Latin. And the same thing I'll tell you about when you are talking about Indian languages, for that matter. And so whichever the grammar in Indian languages are heavily influenced by Sanskrit. And I'll tell you one of the things, and I give these examples, I quote in many places, you know. Let's say you talk about singular and plural. And we're talking about noun, you know, plural formation in noun. In English, the scenario is different. Only singular and plural. And here is also singular and plural. And you just look at any traditional school book or traditional grammar. Even we have read or we have been taught that in Bangla or many Indo-Aryan languages, it's not only Bangla, in many Indo-Aryan languages, there are three plurals, you know, Ekbachan, Dvachan, and Bahubachan. Ekbachan means singular, Dvachan means two. So if there are two nouns, then you have a marker, and Bahubachan is there are many, you know, more than two. So the whole thing about, because Sanskrit has this Ekbachan, Dvachan, and Bahubachan. And I think we have many speakers of Indo-Aryan languages. You will see that whichever the languages you speak or you have, so to say, read or learned, you will see that that's what the grammars are written, whether it's Assamese, even Hindi grammars for that matter. You'll see that there is a mention of Dvachan. And so that's what I'm saying. So the ways Latin has a kind of influence in other Germanic and Romance languages, the same way Sanskrit has a major influence in different Indo-Aryan languages, and not only Indo-Aryan languages, at the same time different Indian languages, I am saying. And India represents at least 4 language families here. So Sanskrit has a major influence here. Okay, so so now that's what I was trying to tell you, that so why is this happening? And if you talk about let's say talking about the timeline somewhere, how it came into picture. So 500 BC, and that is the classical period. And I'm talking about English to some extent. All these Roman alphabets, even if we're talking about. So who developed these Roman alphabets, if you're aware of writing systems and all? So it's basically Greeks. So the Greeks developed alphabets and established parts of speech. So whole tradition of the study of parts of speech, that's what I think Sara Abdullah was talking about, parts of speech, all those categories, what we are talking about, noun, verb, adjective, adverb, all there are 8, different parts of speech. So Greeks, they have done it, and somewhere 500 AD to 1500 AD. So all Greece basically dominated, and then in the Middle Ages, somehow after that, what happened? Subject of grammar evolves and main focus on Latin, 1500 to 1650 AD, and you would try to remember, if you are aware of this whole tradition, that especially this is the time of Renaissance. You know what is Renaissance, So, and Renaissance, that's the time. There's a new kind of consciousness, and it's related to technology as at the same time. Why is this so? Because this is the time of advent of printing press, and when this advent of printing press, and it generated lots of interest in vernacular languages. And this is the time somewhere 1500 to 1650 AD, if you know this, the history, whole history. And from there onward, you try to see the history, that there is a gradual spread of literacy and demand for education, including foreign languages, education by means of text, by means of grammars, and by means of dictionaries. So there is a demand for this. Earlier, there is not so much demand for, learning second language, whichever the second language for that. So Renaissance played a really important role, if you are talking about, and in England, and this is the time where England and the British colony, where it's were everywhere. If you look at in most of the parts of the world, so England dominated, and so the Royal Society established this committee to improve English, and this is the time 1664. Somewhere I was telling about 1650. So Royal Society, they established a committee to improve English, and these are the people I have already told you. Samuel Johnson, and Samuel Johnson published a dictionary of the English language. Later on, you must have heard about Jonathan Swift also. He called for an English academy, Jonathan Swift, and Samuel Johnson, Robert Louith. Robert Louith, he himself published a short introduction to English grammar, 1768. And Defoe, Daniel Defoe, really interesting, Daniel Defoe, what he says, just I would like to quote Daniel Defoe, that kind of view. So Daniel Defoe says that our language is extremely imperfect. its daily improvements are by no means in proportion to its daily corruptions. Corruptions, he's talking about corruptions, imperfection related to corruption. In many instances, it offends against every part of grammar. So that's what that Daniel Defoe swept a proposal for correcting, improving, and ascertaining the English tongue. So these are the kind of mindset people they have. They wanted to ascertain, they wanted to fix English for that matter, and so the point was made by Jonathan Swift, and the next point, Daniel Defoe, his I think the essay on projects, that's what 1697, and he quotes that it would be as criminal then to coin words as money. Talking about coining new words also. They're trying to put kind of certain constraint, you cannot coin certain new words. And even if you coin a new word, as if like it's a criminal things you're doing. So that kind of mindset. And we know that, how this word formation and how this word creation, whatever, word formation, it's a productive process. And we had seen it. I teach a course, morphology as well. I taught morphology for many years, more than 10 or 12 years, let's say. And the whole word formation process, as you know, it's very productive. There are many new words come into language, many new words for that matter. Even I think last time some newspaper, and last year there is an article in Hindustan Times. It came, so they are looking at, especially in this pandemic time, which are the words during this pandemic time. And Oxford English Dictionary, they come up with some words, every year. So they made. I had an interview with this people, and they interviewed me that why do you think that, why these are the words are chosen as the words of the English Oxford English Dictionary. So I think my interview is already there somewhere. Anyway, so what I'm saying is that so that you cannot put a constraint to word formation process. So words will definitely come. Even this Corona period, even if you talk about the Corona period, we had seen there are many words, and the word for that matter, mask. I'm sure many Indian languages, the word mask, we have either borrowed or borrowed it from English, or there are many, maybe the word mask itself, we must have translated or in our mother tongue, whichever the mother tongue we're talking about here. Or maybe some people just simply borrowed mask. I do not know what is the word equivalent word for mask, Sarah, in your language, and especially in Corona time. What do you use? Let's say, do you use in Arabic? I am sure that it's a different word.
Yes, sir. Yeah, qina.
Qina is a different word, huh?
Yeah, qina.
Okay. So, so something like that, and especially during this India, if you're talking about demonetization, so nobody thought about this demonetization, and even the word itself, demonetization. So in Hindi, it is Notbandi. Bangla, any speaker of Bangla, did you borrow Notbandi from Hindi?
Yes,
or something
sir.
else?
So
Is it Notbandi?
Yes, sir.
No, Natasha. Anyone else in the Bangla speaker? Notbandi is there, Natasha, very much is there, but there is another word. If you look at Anandabajar Patrika and some other standard Bangla form, they say Bimudrikaran. Bimudrikaran or Bemudrikaran. Have you heard about it, Natasha?
No, sir.
That's what, Bemudrikaran, Mudrikaran. So Be is that demonetization. So many languages. Yes.
Sir, in Arabic, qina or qima.
Yes,
Mudra is money. Mudra is money. Be means that's the negative prefix, and Karan is again nominative. And it is again heavily borrowed from Sanskrit, Chandan, you wanted to say something?
Yes, sir. I was saying Bemudrikaran was in Hindi or is in Hindi.
Yeah, so even that's what I'm saying. This is heavily Sanskritized, and the heavily Sanskritized version. What is happening is that in Bangla also, and Bangla is very, even if you talk about the standard Bangla, it is very, very heavily influenced by Sanskrit. You see, the Bangla of Bankim, even Rabindranath Tagore for that matter, heavily influenced by Sanskrit. So the Bemudrikaran word was used, and but mostly in Hindi, the word Notbandi. If you ask anyone for that matter, so Notbandi is like everybody will understand. So what I'm saying is that that kind of mindset, whether it is Jonathan Swift or Daniel Defoe, so their understanding was that it would be as criminal to coin words as money. You cannot coin words as well, new words, So the whole tradition, the prescriptive tradition, as I was telling you that I was talking about England at the same time in United States in the 18th century, in the late 17th century for that matter, So Lindley Murray, one of the linguist, prescriptive grammarians, Lindley Murray, again focusing on English grammar, and so there are many people, not only in Great Britain, but at the same time in United States also. So the prescriptive traditions, we had seen that. Okay, so why now the question is, let's say, as a linguist, let's say we always question the prescriptive rules, prescriptive traditions, why we have to follow these things, and so why prescriptive grammars? Even after that, we know that prescriptive grammars are bad. Why prescriptive grammarians, they are successful, and why prescriptive grammars for that matter? So what do you think about in your understanding?
Hello, sir.
Yeah, Prajal.
Prajwal. So the discussion that we had last semester, and Smithy pointed out that standard dialect is important in a way. So to establish that lingua franca, I think it is important to have a prescriptive grammar and prescriptive grammarists.
That's true. That's true. The last semester and the last class, Prajal?
Last lecture, sir.
That's what. I think last semester, I don't know who discussed about all these things in detail. Anyway, so maybe in the last class. Anyway, so the prescriptive grammars, this part is already discussed in the last class as well. So the prescriptive rules provide a standard form of a language that is accepted by most speakers of a language. We all understand. And a set of standard rules are also necessary for students learning second language. I think I made this point. Even if you would like to learn a second language, so because the variety, there are different varieties are there, regional varieties, social varieties. So you need to select a particular variety, So whichever the language, whether you're teaching Arabic, Hindi, Bangla, or Japanese, whichever the languages, so you need to have a standard rules, or let's say particular grammar. Only one variety has to be chosen. Okay. This serve a useful purpose for language teachers and language learners as well. So language teachers and language learners, and there is a social, economic, political reasons for the existence, and try to understand the other factor is that, and this is the more practical, pragmatics things are concerned here. So there is a social, economic, and political reason for the existence. The prescriptive rules are used as an aid in social mobility, social upliftment, because if you speak this variety and if you speak that variety, so there are many people, they'll try to associate with you that yes, somewhere you speak whether the Kolkata variety or the Delhi variety or Khari Boli variety, or let's say the Bihari Bhojpuri variety. So there is a kind of acceptance to whatever the social acceptance. So if you speak a particular variety, so there is a social mobility or upliftment is there, and as a result, even the standard grammar or standard whatever the standard we're talking about, dictionaries for that matter. So bookstores, so there are many people, prescriptive grammarians, they will write many books, and bookstores are full of this English, whatever English grammar. I'm talking about the standard grammars. It could be Hindi grammar or it could be English grammars. And those language purists, they attempt to save the language, and this language or linguist purist, mainly, they will never disappear. They will come again and again. And if you remember, I think, and many people, they blame the young generation, that these young generations have, or they have just ruining English language. Not only English language, whichever the language you are talking about, whichever the language, whether it's English, Bangla, Hindi, and any other language for that matter, Arabic. So they say that they don't know how to speak, and always mixing up words, and and also at the time of writing, also, they do not know how to write also, and yeah, there are, a whole tradition is there at times. I don't know. I also belong to the same tradition. Either you can, talking about my age and look also, you can say that, yeah, I'm so young, but at the same time, I may not be young, So I belong to the old tradition as well. So if somebody is writing an email with informal style, so there is no address, no sir, madam, or whatever, and so I take it in a different way, because the email, which is a formal communication, you should not write to your whoever, for the teachers, or if it is an official correspondence, you should not treat it as a kind of chat. So, and I had seen it, many students and many young people, for that matter, they do it. So there is no address, nothing is there. And the way they chat people in their phone chat box, somewhere else, simply, they write it. And as a result, I interacted with many professors, and so they feel that, oh, these young generations, they do not know how to write, mainly when you talk about this. So that's what I'm saying, that I take it in a different way. People are not writing email in a proper manner, and we know how to write email, So please be careful if you are writing email to your professors. And okay, so this language purists are always there. They will come with that standard set of rules, and okay, and but one of the things the language purists, they forget that the language change is a natural process, and particular uses will gain acceptance, and definitely particular uses will gain acceptance. And this language purist, they keep on blaming the television, newspaper, young generations, modern technology, and all. So they keep on blaming that, yeah, because of these people, language is impure, it is ruined, and all other things, So they forget the main thing, that language change is a natural process, and that particular uses will gain acceptance. Okay, so this is where briefly I talked about prescriptive grammar. Now let's come back to descriptive grammar. And the whole descriptive grammar, the idea, I think we have already discussed, and Smriti also pointed out, and we have initially just this is where, in contrary to the prescriptive rules, and there are many descriptive grammarians, and not only descriptive grammarians, most of them are mainly linguists, some linguists, some even non-linguist in nature as well. And so this, I'm just quoting John Fell, and so John Fell, what he says, that it is certainly the business of a grammarian to find out and not to make the laws of a language. So our job is to find out. So our job is to describe and explain the language, not to make laws of particular language, laws the way, whether it's but in science, certain laws, whether it's Newton's law and some other laws, So no, it is not our job. Rather, our job is to describe and explain the language, And this is one of the James Kilpatrick, 1998, and this is one of the character. It says that just read the sentence aloud Amanda, and listen how it sounds. If the sentence sounds okay, go with it. If not, rearrange the pieces, then throw out the rule books and go to bed. So kind of questioning the whole prescriptive traditions, throw out the rule books and go to bed. If the sentence sounds okay, go with it, means referring to the intuition. If your intuition is saying that if the sentence is right, then go ahead with, and if it is wrong, it's okay. Forget about the rule books, throw out the rule books, and go to bed. So our job, linguists, let's say, and descriptive grammarians, mostly our understanding about grammar is mainly descriptive, not prescriptive. So linguists concern themselves with discovering what speakers know. That's what the competence part we discussed, and about language and describing that knowledge objectively. So it's objectively, and so that would be our job. And even if you talk about grammars, mainly in the descriptive traditions. So in English, we are not saying that never end a sentence with a preposition. And so how we are going to make kind of statement with just simply looking at the structure of the language. Let's say adjectives precede the noun, they modify. So in English, we had seen that, let's say boy, if the boy is tall, we can say that the tall boy or a tall boy. So tall is basically modifying the noun. So in English, we can say that adjectives precede the noun, they modify. So that's our description. Now, what about, let's say, plural formation? In plural formation, if you look at the plural formation process, whole plural formation process in English, the prescriptive rules are different, but our rules, mainly the linguistic rules, we have, so to say, what we know that, to form the regular plural form of a noun, so sa, za, and is added. Sa, za is added, za, sa, za, and is, So I think in the phonetics phonology course, you are aware about this descriptive rules, so to say, and why sa, za, and is, So why is it so? And anyone? Why there are three? I'm talking about sa, za, and is, but in prescriptive rules, a traditional school book, you will see that plural is formed by adding sa and es. Anyone?
Sir, could you please repeat your question once again?
Shivam, I'm saying that especially if you talk about traditional school grammar, in traditional school grammar, when you talk about the plural formation process, it says that plural is formed by adding sa or es. Okay. But in linguistics, so to say, in your phonetics phonology course, you must have learned that for especially regular plural formation, there is addition of sa, za, and is.
Sir, they are allophones of each other, and they are in substitution relationship with each other. When sa, za, and whatever you told right now, they form plurals in English language, just like in other language. And sometimes when they are in complementary relationship with each other, actually sa, za, and is are in complementary relationship with each other. They can't come in place of one another, I think.
Okay.
Sorry, sir, I don't have definite explanations.
Okay, Shivam. So it's understood it's not allophones when I'm talking about, it's basically allomorph, okay? Because in phonetics phonology, that is phoneme, and phoneme has allophones, phones, and here we're talking about...
So
yes, sir, sorry, sir.
These are allomorphs, and so
Yes,
it depends on the phone that it is preceding.
Okay. So yeah, so that's what we talked about, distributions and all. That's what I'm saying. So we are looking at and we're trying to describe the phenomena here, and On the other hand, if you look at traditional school grammar books, Shibam, what is happening that they are predicting it on the basis of the written language, because their focus is on the written language. But our focus is not on the written language mainly. Linguistics, the whole tradition, even Saussure and others, 1916 and all. If you look at, so the focus is here in the spoken forms, not the written forms. So the whole historical reconstructions later, maybe I'll tell you that the linguistics itself started focusing on the spoken forms, and so the way we're describing the language is also based on our how it is pronounced, not how it is written, So our descriptive rules here. So let's say the regular plural noun, a plural formation in English by the addition of sa and is, So descriptive rules accept the patterns of his patterns a speaker actually uses and try to account for them. So actually what is being used, and not the kind of fantasy or whimsicality someone has, and that, okay, this should be something like this should be something like this. No, it's not the case, So the whole descriptive tradition, if you're talking about, so 19th century Europe and somehow Europe, and it also became so widespread in the United States in the 20th century, and the whole structural grammar, if you're talking about, just I mentioned, Saussure, Ferdinand de Saussure, and so the fundamental goal of descriptive grammar is to describe the various types of structures in a specific language. So they're trying to look at different various types of structure in a specific language, and so they have this understanding, that linguistic understanding, that no language or a variety of language is superior to any other in a linguistic sense. So in our understanding, the same kind of understanding that no language or a variety of language is superior to any other in a linguistic sense. And in our understanding also, that is for so every grammar is equally complex. So whichever the grammar we are talking about, so there is a kind of understanding that this language grammar is simple and that language grammar is complex. It's not the case, So every grammar is equally complex, logical, and capable of producing an infinite number of sentences to express any thought. So whichever the languages, whichever the grammar you are talking about, every language is complex in its own way. And so the understanding what we have, let's say, at times we think that Chinese is very complex and very difficult language to learn, because this mindset or this understanding we do have, because we are looking at Chinese from Indo-Aryan language perspective, from English language perspective. For you, let's say the difficulty in learning Chinese is mainly in the tonal level. It's in the tonal level, because there are different tones, at least 3 tones. Chinese, or for that matter, many Tibeto-Burman languages has tones. And Indo-Aryan languages, let's say except Punjabi has some lexical tones, only in the words, not in the sentential level. So Indo-Aryan languages, Dravidian languages, they do not have tones, and you're going to look at, for that matter, English for that matter also. English doesn't have tones, and many European languages doesn't have tone. So you have that mindset that, Chinese is very difficult to learn, and the grammar of Chinese is really complex. And these people also, they also look at our language in a similar manner. Same manner. If you are talking about, I think Sarah is also joining from Arabic, Syria, and for many of us, Arabic is very difficult. But if you look at Arabic, though I do not know how to speak in Arabic, but I find Arabic is so good in the sense, if you talk about the grammar itself, very, very interesting, So, but at the outset, from outsider perspective, you find it very difficult. So it's the perception level, basically. Linguistically, our understanding is that every grammar is equally complex. And so talking about Arabic, and I'm really fascinated by the structure of Arabic. Let's say the word you have a root kataba. That's the triconsonantal root, and there itself you have kataba, kutib, kutiba, and the whole derivation and the inflectional process goes on. Pretty interesting, isn't Sarah? So katab, kutib, kataba, and
كتب يكتب كتاب مكتب
kitab, maktab, and there you have a prefix here, maktab, and though you have only few prefixes.
مكاتب and a lot of derivations.
Derivations and inflections are there, so some prefixes and suffixes are there. So a particular child is learning the whole thing, kataba, if you're talking about, and it's not only kataba, and it's pretty really interesting language. A triconsonantal root, you have 4 consonants, very less 4 consonantal roots. The same way, let's say gadala, so you may have gidal, gadala. So the whole
yes.
Yeah, so
a lot of
yes, whole vocalic melody which is being inserted. Vocalic melody, I'm talking about the vowels. So vowels will be inserted in between the consonants. So ga, da, la. So whether it's a, u, or a, e, u. It's really interesting to look at. So without knowing, we make that kind of perception that this language is complex, this language is simple. It is basically layman's understanding. You see, so linguistically, in our understanding, every grammar is equally complex, logical, and capable of producing an infinite number of sentences to express any thought. So whichever the language we are talking about, and in the perception level, if you say that this is simple and this is complex, try to understand, even to master your own language, whichever the language you speak, even you have taken a lot of time. It's not only 1 year or 2 years, many years, and still we're learning. Still, you cannot say that I am a proficient or whatever speaker of Hindi. There are many other factors. Yes, you can speak Hindi, but still you are learning. There are many new words, vocabularies. It comes. You do learn. So still, yes, Sanchita, I think you raised your hand, Sanchita. Is there any question, Sanchita?
Yes, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, Sanchita. Go ahead, Sanchita.
Yes, sir. So, just a few minutes back, you mentioned that in a linguistic sense, no language is superior than the other. Just right now you said. So, on that, I would like to ask you something. That on what basis did we say that this is the standard form of language and this isn't? Like mostly, it is said now that that a few languages do have scripts and a few don't. And so in some senses, this language has a script, makes that language superior than other languages which are commonly known as dialects or regions. So then on what basis do we classify or declassify that a language is standard or not?
Yeah. So Sanchita, the question, though I could not hear you, because maybe the network connection. Yeah, so maybe you have a poor network connection. Anyway, so whatever I have understood, Adya, please unmute yourself. There's a background noise.
Sorry, sir.
Okay. Yeah. So Sanchita, what I have understood, you are talking about that language superior. How do we know that which language is superior? I'm talking about linguistically. So linguistically, the word, when I'm saying linguistically, if you look at a particular structure of a language, so structure, whether it is in the phonetics level, morphology level, syntax level, or semantics level, looking at the structure, you cannot say that this structure is superior or that structure is superior. You cannot say this. That's what the main understanding. Okay, linguistically we're saying. So when you talk about superiority or inferiority, it's totally based on the kind of perception, the kind of polity and politics, state support, government support, media, and all other things. I think last class we also discussed about it. So it depends on that. And as a result, we have that particular kind of perception. And you also mentioned about this, script thing. Script is also not a defining criteria when you talk about superiority of a particular language. There are many languages in the world, they do not have script for that matter. There are many languages. There are more than 6,000 languages in the world, and you will hardly found in the whole world. In my understanding, there are more, I think somewhere around 150 to 150 or less than 150 scripts. I'll have to see the figure, how many scripts are there, but less than 100 to 150 scripts you will find. But there are more than 6,000 languages in the world. And talking about the script, even in Indo-Aryan languages, if you talk about, so many Indo-Aryan languages, they use Devanagari script. So even this should not be taken as the criteria, and there are many other criteria talking about the superiority and even the classical language for that matter. The whole notion of classical languages, people say that Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and even for that matter, Arabic, they are the classical languages. So the concept of classical language itself is political. Itself is political, and also dominated by the whole religious traditions, if you look at it, and religious and political things. And later on in India, people mainly, I know the whole politics here. That's what I'm telling you. The people who are in the committee, Professor Anbita B, and there are many people, who are there in the committee. They were sharing me all these things, So last time, it's a recent phenomena that in Tamil, for that matter, I think we have a Tamil speaker. The Tamil was considered to be a classical language, and we all know. So Telugu also come into picture as one of the classical language. Then Odia people started also claiming that Odia is also classical language. It is also declared as classical language. And then Malayalam people, they are offended that why Malayalam should not be considered as a classical language. And Malayalam was also considered as a classical language somewhere in 2012. And in that committee, I'll simply tell you, in that committee, Santhali was also there. And if you look at Santhali, in compared to Malayalam and other Indo-Aryan and Dravidian languages, Santhali is, if you talk about the history, and the Santhali community, the Austro-Asiatic community for that matter, in India, they are, in my understanding, they are the indigenous people. They must have come or inhabited the land before the Indo-Aryans. So their language, the problem is that there are many cultures, they do not have scripts. They do not have scripts, but they have really rich folk literature. The oral literature we are talking about, So the one culture has, so to say, the written forms or the written script, and somehow they dominate it. So the whole thing about it's a matter of polity and politics, So the superiority thing, what we are discussing so far, it's a matter in the perception level, in the politics level, polity and politics level. Okay, linguistically, if you're talking about, no language or variety of language is superior to any other in a linguistic sense. When you are talking about linguistic sense, you cannot say that CV. Let's say I'm talking about the phonetics here. CV. So if you look at in the whole world, the way the consonant cluster, so you will say that CV, CVC, so CV, then CV, C, and CVV and CVC. And now, let's say English, we have this, so to say, in a particular syllable. So 3 consonants may be permitted in the initial position. That's the onset position, and 3 may be permitted in the coda position after the vowel, if you were aware about this, so to say, the consonant clusters. So the syllable is onset and rhyme. Rhyme is again nucleus and coda. Nucleus is the vowel. Before the nucleus, what we call onset. After the nucleus, what we call coda. Okay. So onset and coda, that's the whole thing about onset and coda. So let's say some language has this kind of cluster, C. So some language has this kind of cluster, C, and then V, that's the nucleus, and then C. And you say that, this is really complex. this is really complex. And other language, simple language, they have CV and CV. And then you say, yeah, it's very simple. Not necessarily. Every language has its own structure. Every language has its own rules. So many Tibeto-Burma languages, you will find that CV structure. They are following the CV structure. And many, even within Indo-Aryan languages, if you are talking about Indo-Aryan languages, they also try to do this cluster simplification. So as a result, I think as a result, let's say the word park, for that matter, P-A-R-K, park, which is the English word. So park, maybe many varieties, regional varieties, they will say that parak, the cluster simplification is going on, so because inherently they have this CV kind of structure. Anyway, so what I'm saying is that looking at the linguistic structure, so we cannot say that this is really complex and this is really simple, so it is, so every language, it's equally complex in its own way, and it's logical and capable of producing an infinite number of sentences to express any thought, for that matter. Okay, so the descriptive grammar, if you look at the descriptive grammar and the timeline of the descriptive grammar, and the whole comparative tradition, the historical tradition, and one of the person here, you must have heard about this person, I am not sure about, but you must have heard about William Jones. I don't know whether William Jones, anyone heard about William Jones?
Yes, sir. Founder of the Linguistic Survey of India.
Not Linguistic Survey, Asiatic Society.
Asiatic Society. So sorry.
Yeah, so Asiatic Society in Bengal, somewhere in 1782.
Sanskrit scholar, sir.
Yeah, very, very profound scholar. He knew many languages. A super polyglot, at least 7 or 8 languages. He was very, very fluent. And so William Jones, if you talk about, and this is the time of historical linguistics, comparative method, grammar, historical reconstruction. What I'm saying is that, and this is the time of diachronic linguistics. Diachronic linguistics, you must have heard about diachronic linguistics, synchronic linguistics, diachronic linguistics, comparing, languages of one period to another period, So William Jones, and so that's one of the scholar. So what he did, he compared many languages, mainly Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek, and and try to see that, and that was the time, and try to look at the reconstruction and try to relate that which is the mother language, or and from where the languages must have originated, and the whole notion of Proto-Indo-European, so to say, Indo-European or Proto-Indo-European, and surprisingly, if you try to see that the whole tradition there, beginning with Sir William Jones, and there are many people later on. You must have heard about this Jacob Grimm's, Werner's. These are the things, Grimm's law, Werner's law. So there are many words, and so let's say the word father. Father in Sanskrit is pita, and Latin is pater, and in English is father, and Greek also, let's say. So they try to compare many words, and they found lots of similarities, with this, some basic words, and they also looked at different rules also, that pa is changing to fa, ba is changing to va. What is the whole rule of Grimm's law? Pa is changing to fa. Whenever you have a pa sound, there in the next Germanic languages you will have fa. So maybe Pauthang, I think Pauthang is teaching you historical linguistics and reconstruction and all. So he may tell you this, detail about all that kind of things. So what I'm saying that, so this is the time, the historical linguistics, comparative method of reconstruction, and later on what happened from that time, and earlier what happened, all these people who were looking at languages, they are mainly looking at written languages, not the spoken language, written languages. So the languages, let's say I just mentioned, Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek. So later on, there is a rise of structuralism, and this somewhere started in the 19th century, not 19th, but 20th century, I can say. And and this is the time if Ferdinand de Saussure, I think you know this book, A Course in General Linguistics, 1916, which was posthumously published by his students. I think by students. So he died in 1913, and after 3 or 4 years, that book was published in 1916, A Course in General Linguistics. And from there itself, if you look at the whole tradition of structuralism or descriptive linguistics started, and even from diachronic linguistics to synchronic linguistics, it has started. And we have figure like Edward Sapir. I don't know whether you have heard about Edward Sapir. Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. At least I think you are aware about Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Sapir and Whorf. Bloomfield and Bloomfield books, 1933. The name of the book is Language. And so following this structuralism or structural model of language, so people started writing grammar, descriptive grammar. So one of the descriptive grammar is Krapp's Modern English, 1999. Krapp's, Krapps, Krapp's Modern English, 19. Leonard's Current English Uses. Even Leonard's Bloomfield's Current English Uses. David Fry's American English Grammar. So all these grammars are written following the descriptive traditions. Okay. So so I think so far we have understood what is descriptive grammar, and now within the types of grammar I mentioned you, there is a teaching grammar, and in applied linguistics course, though we have mentioned about prescriptive grammar, descriptive grammar, we should be aware of at the same time teaching grammar as well. So what is this teaching grammar? And teaching grammar, can any one of you simply tell me what kind of expectation we do have when you are talking about teaching grammar, or what is teaching grammar? Okay, so anyway, so I didn't talk about teaching grammar, but let me tell you. So when you talk about teaching grammar, so at least there is expectation that the people, they know a particular language, and then let's say, so teaching grammar assumes that the student already knows one language and compares the grammar of the target language with the grammar of native language. Let's say one of our student, he learned Arabic. I think Diksha also, she knows French in addition to Hindi and English. But let's say when you are taught Arabic or Hindi, so the model of grammar, let's say at least they expected that either you know English or Hindi, whatever, and they after that they started teaching you in that manner. Even in the class, maybe teacher was speaking in English or maybe Hindi, whatever the language for that matter. So there is expectation. So it explicitly states the rules of the language, words and their pronunciation, meanings and gloss. So in another language, let's say, so that is Hindi or English, you're learning Arabic, but the things are explained in another language, okay, slowly and gradually. So you have to have a, let's say, words and their pronunciation, meaning and gloss and all other things, So within this teaching grammar, how a particular language is taught, and this applied linguistics course, and that's what I think in the next unit we'll move on to language teaching, or ELT, not only ELT, language teaching or second language teaching, and different kind of methods. So within this teaching grammar, you must have heard about there are different kind of methods, or there are different kind of practices, approaches are being employed by many teachers. If you have heard about, you must have heard about grammar translation method. I'm sure you must have heard about grammar translation method, audio-visual method, audiolingual method, communicative methods, all there are different types of methods, reading methods, there are many other methods. So the whole survey of methods we'll be talking about in this course. In the next unit, at least there will be 7 or 8 lectures, or maybe more than that. Let me see. So we'll talk about the whole tradition of tradition there. Okay. So this is where the teaching grammar, and then now let's say when you talk about grammar, within this grammar, there is a conception of generative grammar, and I think who was talking about? I think Saket, Siddharth Saket was talking about language is somewhere in the mind or in the brain, you know. So that's the whole concept of generative grammar. So so language is not only the social construct, but Chomsky, let's say, the generative traditions, people try to locate language somewhere in the mind or brain. So it's a mental construct, you see. So this concept of generative grammar began developing in 1950s. 1950s. Why 1950s? That's the time, you know, Chomsky is coming into picture, you know, after 1950s. And so generative grammar, you know, if you look at generative grammar, there are different names. It's a blanket name for many grammars for that matter. So it's also referred by transformational grammar and the whole theory of syntax for that matter. So I think in the last class I must have mentioned, if Aisha, Professor Aisha is teaching you course, you know, syntax, and so you must be aware about all this, you know, transformational grammar, TG, transformational generative grammar, standard theory. I just mentioned about standard theory 1965, is extended standard theory, government and binding theory, the GB, the whole GB thing, principles and parameters, and the minimalist program for that matter, MP. So it's a blanket name for all these things, are blanket name for generative grammar, you know. So when you talk about generative grammar, so they try to study the representation of language in the mind, you know, representation of language in the mind. And what is the goal of generative grammar? So it tries to describe the unconscious linguistic knowledge of the speaker. So unconscious linguistic knowledge of the speaker, especially the knowledge common to speaker of all languages, and not only try to understand here, not only one language, also try to look at languages common to speakers of all languages. So that's what Chomsky make a distinction between lowercase l and as well as uppercase L. You understand it, and I think whole concept of, so lowercase l is instantiation of the uppercase L. So human language capacity, that the uppercase L. So the idea of generative grammar is we are going into the mind, looking at human as a species, and what kind of grammar, so to say, the universal grammar we do have in our mind. How is it being represented? What kind of structure is there? You know, so very interesting. Try to read Chomsky, and there are many things, let's say, will be clear to you. So the tacit knowledge enables speakers to distinguish between well-formed and ill-formed words and utterances in their language. So that's the tacit knowledge, that's the unconscious knowledge we talked about, the subconscious, not unconscious, but subconscious knowledge that distinguish between which sentence is well-formed sentence and which sentence is ill-formed sentences, you know. So that's the intuition we're talking about, you know. So if you're talking about generative grammar in a word, let's say, so generative grammar is a system of explicit rules which may apply recursively to generate an infinite number of sentences which can be as long as one wants them to be. So there is no upper limit of the sentence. So you can keep on adding and adding, you know, one clause, another clause, next clause, you know. So recursiveness or recursivity is one of the property of the generative grammar, you know, for that matter, you know. So let's say one sentence, if I say Sita saw the picture of a baby on the table in the jungle hut cafe, you can go on and on, you know. So there is no upper limit of the sentence, you know. And the focus here is given to competence, not to performance, okay. So when you talk about generative grammar, let's say the universal grammar for that matter, so within that, so Chomsky bring the concept of universal grammar. So what do you mean by UG or universal grammar? So Chomsky, for that matter, contains that linguistic capacity of human is innate. So linguistic capacity of humans is innate. So general character of linguistic knowledge is determined by the nature of the mind, which is endowed with specialized language faculty. So we have a language faculty, human language capacity. And this faculty is determined in turn by the biology of the brain. Okay, so this faculty is determined by the biology of the brain. So the human child is born with the blueprint of language, which is called universal grammar. So what is universal grammar? So when you're talking about being human, that means being human means you have a language for that matter. So the human child is born with a blueprint of language, which is called universal grammar. So according to Chomsky, universal grammar is the faculty of the mind which determines the nature of language acquisition in the infant and of linguistic competence. So UG will determine the nature of language acquisition and at the same time linguistic competence. So now the question is that, let's say if UG is there for us, let's say all of us, all the children, being human, let's say you have a particular language, you have language for that matter. So why is it so? Why cannot we speak the day we are born? We should start speaking our language. And then why there are many languages in the world? There are more than 6,000 languages in the world. If you say so there is human language capacity. So we should speak in one language. So that's what L and lowercase l, so instantiation of languages. So that doesn't matter. So there are certain things, there are certain rules, certain principles are there. So Chomsky is talking about those principles. So those principles are innate in nature. So we know there are many things. So we'll talk about those principles, and so although languages differ from each other, but the structural differences between them occur within the fairly narrow range sanctioned by the universal grammar. Try to understand, it's really interesting to look at. Chomsky will talk about there is two different kind of structures. One is surface structure, another is underlying structure. So he says that underlyingly languages are the same. But if you look at the surface structure, in surface structure we have lots of differences. Underlyingly it's basically the same. And so whichever the differences, structural differences between them occur within the fairly narrow range sanctioned by the universal grammar. Only fairly narrow range, so minimum kind of differences. So the language faculty of the mind is essentially the same in all humans. So the language faculty you are talking about, human language capacity, is essentially the same in all humans, whether you are Chinese and whether you are Indian or Malaysian, Bangladeshi, or whoever you are, it's basically the same, and even talking about the religion also, whether you are Hindu, you are Christian, you are Muslims, it doesn't matter. So the language faculty of the mind is essentially the same in all humans. Okay, so how this universal grammar structured? So Chomsky says that universal grammar, it is modular in structure. So it is modular in structure. There's so modular in structure, and it consists of various subsystems of principles and various subsystems, various principles. Many of its principles consist of parameters which are fixed by experience on the basis of simple evidence of the kind available to the child. So as I already told you, the principles are there, systems are already there, and how there are different parameters, how the parameters are fixed, depending on the experience. It's a kind of exposure. So, and really interesting, and he compares this universal grammar, to an intricate electrical system. Try to understand this, I think if you understand this analogy or the comparison, so I think you'll be able to get it, how this universal grammar is structured. So let's say he says that Chomsky compares this UG or universal grammar to intricate electrical system that is all wired off. So the wiring is done, but not switched on. So all the wiring thing is done, switch and everything is there, but it's not switched on. The system contains a finite set of switches. So you have finite set of switches. Each one of which has a restricted number of positions. And the switch, they have a restricted number of positions. But the switches are not on. How the switches are on? Once particular exposure to that particular language, then switches are on. Let's say X is exposed to Hindi or Y is exposed to English. So that switches will be on, and as a result, he gets this language, or Arabic or Bangla, whatever, Bhojpuri, Angikan. So exposure to a specific language experience is required to turn on these switches and give them appropriate setting. So that's the whole concept of parametric setting, principles and parameters. There's principles and parameter approach, So if you try to understand this, the whole how is universal grammar is structured, and so some of these things, let's say abstractly, it's not easy for me to tell just, but let me just give you one example. Let's say one of the principles of UG, for that matter, let's say every language has word order and SOV or SVO, whether it is SOV and SVO. So let's say if I say I eat rice, so that means subject, verb, object. मैं खाना खाता हूँ. That means in Hindi I'm talking about SVO and SOV. मैं खाना, so you have the object SOV. So that let's say.
May I see something?
Just 1 second, Smriti. So what is happening? Let's say one of the principle here. So if a child has learned this or figured out that what is the word structure, because this is being not taught, even not even a single teacher or even your parents are not saying that this is the word order of our language, and the children, they automatically get the clue that this is the word order of my language. And if the child has, let's say, got these things by applying his whatever the intuitions or subconscious knowledge we are talking about. So let's say in Hindi, मैं खाना खाता हूँ. So automatically the next rules he or she is going to learn it or get it. Let's say, so if its SOV parameter is fixed, that means he is going to get postposition in these languages, whichever the languages we are talking about. It SVO, the language SVO word order is there, that means he is going to get prepositions. So there are certain things which are fixed, and so it's really interesting. So we have some principles, and there are different kind of parameters, and the parameters are fixed depending on the exposure to different languages. Smriti, please go ahead.
So you were saying that all languages have a SOV order, but let's say for instance Sanskrit, does it have a fixed SOV order? Like, can't in Sanskrit we jumble the order and it still makes sense?
So talking about Sanskrit, Smriti, is that Sanskrit is free word order language. If you talk about simple declarative sentence, even Sanskrit will have, in simple declarative sentence, Sanskrit will have SOV. One of the thing about Sanskrit and many inflectional languages, what is happening is that because of the heavily inflections, because these are inflectional languages. So you have, let's say, case markings, and because of the case markings, the word can be moved from one position to another positions. Okay, so many people, they say that Sanskrit, there is no word order in Sanskrit. Sanskrit has word order, definitely Sanskrit has word order, but we say there is a free word order language, and not only Sanskrit, many Indo-Aryan languages for that matter, Hindi for that matter, somewhere we can freely move one constituent from one position to another position, many words from one position to another positions, even the meaning of that particular sentence will be intact. but you cannot do it in many Germanic languages or many Germanic languages, for that matter English, let's say. So the word, I can just simply give you one example. Let's say, माँ ने बच्चे को आया से दूध पिलवाया. If I take this sentence, so माँ ने बच्चे को आया से दूध पिलवाया. Can you just translate this sentence, Smriti, in Hindi? No, sorry, in English.
Mother made the child drink milk by the nanny.
Yeah. So now let's say you cannot just move one word from one position to another position, but in Hindi it is still possible. बच्चे को माँ ने आया से दूध पिलवाया is fine, but in English you cannot do it. In English you cannot do it. The reason is that because in Hindi also you have this ergative marking, so far, and as well as the accusative is also being marked, and also followed by postpositions. Also you have also postpositions. So as a result, we know who is doing what, and also there is a morphological causatives going on. So Hindi the same way. So, but if you talk about the canonical structure, I'm talking about canonical structure for that matter. Canonical, it's a simple declarative sentence. So when we say that word order of a particular language, we are talking about simple declarative sentence. Try to understand this. So Greenberg's universals in typology course, I think you will be introduced this language typology by either by me or maybe by Pradeep sir, Dr. Pradeep. So Greenberg's universals, so all these things we discuss about, in language typology. So when you talk about word order, mainly we talk about the word order in simple declarative sentence. And in English, in Sanskrit also, the simple declarative sentence would be SOV. Okay, so really interesting. Okay, so this is what I'm saying, that if this is being, if this is, let's say in a particular language, if SOV, the child has learned that it is SOV, and he or she is going to learn the other thing, like as if like it comes automatically, the postpositions, the concept of postpositions, or the concept of preposition for that matter. If it's SVO, the prepositions will come into picture, So, and there are many rules, there are many principles for that matter. In general, nobody teaches us. As I told you, the parents, school teachers, nobody teaches like what to do. Even the concept of SVO, SOV. But there are many things. The typical structure, even for that matter, the forming WH questions, how to make interrogative questions. So we all learned it, how to make interrogative questions in our language. I think nobody told us. In the second language acquisition, that's a different thing, because we're trying to learn it by our conscious methods. But in general, if you talk about first language acquisition, so there are many things. Children, they know it, how to form, especially in English. If you're talking about WH question formation, it's mainly by auxiliary inversion. But children, they smartly, they master all that kind of rules and all. Okay. So anyway, so this is really interesting. Slowly and gradually, you will be introduced to these things, and so that's what I'm saying, that the whole model, the latest in 1995, Chomsky's, this minimalist program. And if you look at minimalist program and the module of UG, so to say, universal grammar. So universal grammar consists of a number of modules which are interrelated. So whole interface are going on. So lexicon and morphology. So one module, Chomsky keeping lexicon and morphology. Morphology is basically the word formation process. Lexicon is basically the word list and all, regular, irregular words and all that. And morphology is the word formation process. So he's keeping both the things, lexicon and morphology, in one module. And the next module he talks about syntax, and he gives too much importance to syntax. So syntax is that's the way you form words, you form mainly the sentences and whatever, the infinite number of sentences, And the another module, the phonetic form he talks about PF. PF deals with the representation of utterances in his speech. So PF. So whole phonetics and phonology in the structural model, we'll look at phonetics and phonology in somewhere in universal grammar or in generative grammar. Chomsky only say PF, and LF, which is the logical form, or again we call semantics, which deals with meaning. So in generative grammar, so that is the module of universal grammar or generative grammar for that matter. So in one module, he has kept lexicon and morphology, another module syntax, phonetic form, and logical form. But in the structural tradition, if you look at structural tradition, is a different. So this is really interesting. We can keep on discussing. Please do read. I think generative grammar also. If there is, I do have many articles and the books. And then Aisha is teaching you that course also, syntax 1 or syntax 2, whichever the course. And Andrew Carney, Lily Hageman, and even Radford, not Radford. I think Radford also is there. So all these people. So you'll have kind of understanding about universal grammar and also the whole syntax for that matter. Okay, so I think we'll continue our discussion about this, maybe one more class, and please do read chapter 2 from Guy Cook, and we'll have discussion on chapter 2 Guy Cook either in the next class or next to next class, whichever the classes for that matter. So please do read, and then once we are done with unit 1, and we'll move on to our next unit, unit 2. And okay, so I think that's all for today. And since we do not have enough time, if I just any other new topic or anything, so I think I cannot finish within 5 to 10 minutes. So it's better I'll end, and if you have some queries or doubts, let's say, so just 5 minutes you do have, 5 to 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes. Okay, please go ahead if you have anything.